red means record. Yeah, recording is
It
started.
was on. Okay.
Your event is now being recorded.
Okie doke.
There's a chat box.
There
Oh,
is,
people
and
are
are
talking
coming
in.
in. Hi, people.
That's amazing.
Oh,
Hi, Liz.
Doctors are in the house.
hey, people.
Who else? Hi, Fiona. All kinds of students.
Awesome.
Yes,
Sandy.
you're here.
Hi,
I
Sandy.
think this is
Later,
my
Whippets.
first time on the new webinar software too.
Mhm.
So how many do we have? Oh my God, we have 160 people.
Wow. And they'll be coming in for a
I
little
know,
while.
it's a lot.
Mhm.
It's a lot. All right, everybody. So just so that everyone understands, we have a rule here that we have the talking mugs. So those are when, because otherwise we'll talk over each other with the lag. So some of us will have mugs. Some of us will have monsters.
We have talking monsters.
Right.
We have the talking monsters.
Talking monsters. Okay, so we'll do the monsters because I was thinking if we just did the mugs, then if I wanted to drink out of my mug, it'd be hard to do it without making it think I wanted to talk. That would be a problem. So we'll use talking monsters so that way we can explain to each other. Okay, so I'm starting with my monster.
You're starting.
This is Philadelphia, by the way. This head is Phila and this head is Fia. She cost me 50 cents at a garage sale about 30 years ago. She has sat by my computer ever since. So she was lucky to be here. So I am Jessica Hekman, and we're just going to quickly go around and introduce ourselves before we start talking about this fascinating paper. And so I got my PhD in genetics, genomics, and bioinformatics. So it's basically genetic stuff and a lot of computer programming. And yeah, those two are like genetics.
Don't even know what that means.
And I did my dissertation studying the Russian tame foxes. And so I looked at gene expression differences in the brains, particularly parts of the brain related to the stress axis in tame and aggressive foxes. I found very cool things and actually managed to get some of it published in a very little journal. Okay, so Deb is next.
Oh. Okay, you're up to me. Let's see, I got my PhD in 1995, so it's been a while. And I was focused more in social psychology than in behavioral. Though behavioral psychology was always my interest and my specialty. But I ended up studying advertising and jury decision making. That was my dissertation. And I did a lot of reading on persuasion for my comprehensive exams. But I also worked in the rat lab and was involved in a lot of behavioral research with the rats, hands-on, which I really enjoyed. And then, of course, since that time, I've really been more interested in applying the scientific methods to dog training. Okay, that's me. Next.
I know next, but now I'm telling Melissa about the echo. So why don't one of you tell Melissa about the echo while I try to talk?
Melissa wants us to wear headphones.
We're all wearing headphones, but that isn't it because all the attendees can hear this echo.
I'm not wearing headphones, so it's probably entirely my fault.
It can't be because both Deb and I are both echoing, and you.
Yeah, we are echoing.
Have headphones.
That's
Does that
better.
work?
Is that any better?
Did you wear
I have
headphones?
in now. I wasn't.
But we can't.
Oh,
hear
well, they
it.
like it. Echo gone?
They say it's better. It was entirely my fault.
Okay, it was entirely your fault.
Just so we're clear, entirely my fault.
I forgot the question, so I'm just going to pretend to answer some different questions. This is a monster of some kind. Someone else can tell me what it is because it's got 3 eyes, and I think it comes from a movie, and I don't know what. So I'll wait to hear the comments. I got my PhD a bit ago. I don't remember what year, but not so long ago. I went back in later life. And I went to UC Berkeley, and much to my disappointment, my PhD is just in psychology. It isn't in a thing. I would ask, like, what is it? What do I say? Tell people it's in? And my advisor was like, psychology. So it doesn't have a side designation of any kind, but what I studied all sorts of stuff. I was in the developmental section of in my department. So I studied a lot of developmental psych, babies, and how they grow and learn. And it was great to be in that section because the kinds of questions you ask babies and the ways you ask them are the kinds of questions and the ways we want to ask, dogs or non-human animals. And so I got to learn a lot of, it gave me a good ground to be able to ask certain kinds of questions. And what I did for my dissertation was I looked at problem-solving strategies in dogs and, how they choose to just solve a problem I would give them and what would affect that. So I specifically want to know if there was an effect of human presence on that. So if they had a problem to solve, would they solve it differently if they were by themselves compared to when a human was around? And it turns out, yep, they totally do. They rely on us, they use us, and it's very similar to what people do. If I were at your house and needed to solve a problem, I'd solve it through you, not just go and solve it myself. And so I was trying to look at kind of those pieces, how dogs use us and what they think. And if they would be different by themselves than they were. And for things like my quals and for other research I did a lot of stuff on attachment and on causal inference with Alison Gopnik, just a small bit with Alison. And then my quals topics were like oxytocin and touch and kangaroo care and some of the stress. Just you might know, Darlene Francis who did the cross fostering with the rats and the stress. Anyway, so I had a kind of a topic with her. It was really interesting, but mostly I tried to study as much as I could dogs because you in my department you couldn't just get a PhD in dogs, so I kind of have a whole bunch of stuff in the background. Oh. Is that what the question was? Because I made it up because there was a lot of echo.
Yeah, you did good.
Done.
Yeah, so it was definitely harder to get a PhD in dogs in the past. And it's getting easier and easier, but still pretty hard for people to do it. Yeah. There was no way for them to do it in 1995, I wouldn't think.
Yeah.
No, not even close.
But yeah.
Oh, and I'm drinking Diet Coke because I ran out of the drink of doctors.
Oh.
Awesome. I have hot apple cider because it's winter in New England.
Oh man, come on now. You gotta go.
Deb is going to be.
It's Christmas wine.
She'll have the funniest questions.
The funniest. They'll have answers that don't make any sense.
There you go.
Yeah.
But
I mean, do you mean wine, Amy? Yes, Liz. I have wine in my Diet Coke can.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so Jessica,
right,
you were going to start us off?
Yeah, I was. So we have this article, which I loaded up. So I certainly can, if we want to look at it, I can put it on as the presentation. But I'm sure you guys are all enjoying looking at our lovely faces. Oh, but that's, yes, and this is it. And so it is an article in, it's a review article, meaning that it's not about actual direct research. Is basically pulling together a lot of other people's research, which is a really nice kind of thing for folks to read. Just reading the direct research articles sometimes can be a bit overwhelming, but a review article like this, it's like it tells us, sort of pulls a lot of stuff together, so that can be nice. And just a quick note that it is published in a Nature journal, and so Nature is a very highly perceived, high quality suite of journals, and this is one of them. And so we tend to look at the journal and be like, oh, this seems like a good deal. So that is the quick overview. Oh, look, I've frozen again, so I won't be able to see anything. So people will have to say stuff if they wanna have me see.
Okay.
So I basically
watching the chat box.
Yeah, well, it's hard because the plan was for you guys to wave your monsters at me if you wanted to talk, and it's going to be hard for me to see your monsters.
That's all right. It's hard for me to stop myself from interrupting, so it's going to happen anyway. So there you go.
It works perfectly. It sounds like the lag isn't too bad at the moment.
Not too bad.
All right. So I'd promised that I would sort of start giving the sort of providing the structure of this and giving some overview for it. And then Amy and Deb are basically going to harass and heckle, I think, and provide wise insights.
Yes.
So the article basically starts out with this this introduction where it's talking about these concepts of, as an animal is developing, it's going through two types of development. There's sort of species typical development. So there's the development that happens for pretty much every member of the species. And then there's also individual development. So, that could be, in the case of what we're interested in, personality development, and so ways in which you are different from others of your species, or in which dogs are different from others of their species. And I was reading that and thinking, in the case of dogs, it might be interesting to think about breed typical development as well, that, dogs of particular breeds have sort of overlapping traits, and then there's ways in which they're individuals as well. So I'm going to just pause for a second to see if Deb or Amy have any comments on that before I go
on.
Are you frozen still?
I don't know that I have any comments on that, but the article I really liked. As soon as I saw it, I thought there were a couple things about it that were really interesting to me. And I will admit that I do skim over the really, really technical bio and chemical anatomy kinds of things. I know only enough to be very dangerous. I said, amygdala. Oh, I know what that is. And then it's like, oh, there's one kind of amygdala. Shoot, I don't know that. But what I liked, what interested me was, of course, the developmental part, that, how bad experiences or negative experiences affect you can be very different depending on that time frame, whether you're in the childhood, infantile stage, whether you've moved into the adolescent stage or the adult stage, that they're different, and that things that we thought were relatively permanent could actually be changed. And so to me, that was the really fascinating part, is that you can reestablish plasticity. They talk about it very briefly at the end. That's the kind of the part I was wanting to see the most about. And I think they talked about that a little bit briefly at the end, and there wasn't anything really new, at least anything really new that I understood. And I'll have some questions for you if we get to that point to talk about that, because I'm not sure what they're trying to say here.
Right.
Well, I think it's something that we struggle with a lot with dogs, or we think that we see, and I'm talking about this a lot in my class right now, where we're talking about genetics, and we're talking about this concept that there's like this baseline genetic thing, that, there's sort of the baseline temperament, and then there's environment that sort of builds on that, or people have this concept of that, this personality trait showed up in my dog sort of later in life, and therefore it's, and I don't know why it showed up, so it's genetic for sure, versus environmental. And development is such an important part of how a personality develops, right? And that's partly controlled by genetics and partly controlled by environment, but it can make things very hard to change when they develop early on. And we can perceive that as being genetic because it's hard to change. But one thing I really like people to understand is that if it happens early on in development, it can be hard to change whether it's genetic or not. And also that saying that something is entirely genetic is a little weird, as it turns out. It's not quite the way the world works.
No, and
all right, so then
monster.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
It occurred to me, and this isn't quite exactly super accurate, I realize, but it occurred to me that as it was talking about phases, and I don't know if that will get so deep into cue versus context and all of that, but how adolescence encoding was different, and how adolescence is a really long period of time when we own our dogs. I mean, it's a long period of time. It's not like what common literature would have us believe, think of as a fear period. Oh, my dog was in a fear period for a few weeks or a month at 4 months or 5 or 7 to 9 months, that kind of thing. And whereas this paper is talking about changes that are adolescent wide, and adolescence, I mean, I realize that it may not be exactly correlative for our purposes, but adolescence is a very long period of time in which you own your dog, a time when you are doing almost all of your, not only basic training, but most of your beginning sport training, all of your exposure. And, and I don't mean the puppyhood and then the first couple months after that. I mean, till what, 2 years old, 2.5? It's entirely at least plausible that they're in a state where when we see them having their noise phobias or their fear of people or whatnot, we're doing all this exposure stuff and trying to knock it out. And it's like, well, I don't know exactly what this paper is telling me about what I would want to change, but it certainly got me thinking well beyond fear periods and into, something a lot more lasting and less all over the map like fear period. Done.
Deb.
Okay, thank you.
Go, Deb.
Sort of along those same lines, because we talk in dogs so much about fear periods, but nobody really knows what they are. That is so vague. And, well, they're 4 months old or they're 14 months old. Could it be a fear period?
Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
It's hard to say. We don't have any evidence of fear periods. I don't know a lot of scientific evidence. I mean, we talk about sensitivity periods more than we do the critical periods that we used to talk a lot about critical periods of development, and they address that in the article. But once I was introduced to the term sensitivity periods, I like that a lot better. I guess because it doesn't seem totally unchangeable. Oh yeah, not so critical. Exactly, not so totally unchangeable. And it makes me think back to, you guys probably have both read Scott and Fuller at some point in time. What's the name of Social Behavior in Dogs, I guess? And that only thing I ever saw that published anything talking about the sensitivity or critical periods.
Yeah, but this one knows a lot about the critique of that now.
Okay, go, Jess.
So studying, studying in the sense of reading up on critical periods was something I was pretty interested in anyways, but then I'm very lucky right now to be a postdoc in a laboratory where Catherine Lord is also a postdoc, and she is sort of the world expert on socialization in canids, dogs and wolves. So it's amazing. I get to just walk to the office next door and be like, Catherine, I think it's like this. What do you think? And she'll hold forth. It's amazing. So it's been a really great learning experience for me. So Scott and Fuller did some interesting stuff. But there actually was, Catherine, it turned out, did some interesting work with some guide dogs and learned a lot more about the critical period. And then her work wasn't published, and somebody else published something very similar in 2015, which is a paper that I have left to go over pretty much in every class I've ever taught. This thing is just not comfortable. So basically, the idea is that, and this has been shown not just in dogs, but in rats and mice. And we think it's the same in humans, but it's sort of not as clear. Catherine Lord, and it's Kathryn Lord. So basically, so the animal, be it the laboratory rodent or the dog, is born, and it's in this very safe place. It's in the nest with its mom. And it doesn't need to be afraid of anything except for being away from its mom. And that's pretty much the case. It's not going to show fear during these really early stages. At some age, and it's around 4 weeks in dogs, they start leaving the nest and moving around. And at that point, they're not going very far into the world. And everything that they encounter should still be pretty safe. And so they want to learn that what's around them is normal. And so they're still not showing fear at this point. But then somewhere between 5 to 8 weeks of age, and it differs in different dog breeds, which is fascinating, right? The fear response turns on. And so this paper that was published in 2015 has these amazing, where they show these dogs as terrifying novel stimulus. They use this little electric duck. So you turn the duck on and it walks, right? And there's this amazing video of them showing this like 5-week-old Yorkie, and the duck walks towards the Yorkie, and the Yorkie's just like, I don't care. And then they show it at 8 weeks of age, and the duck walks to the Yorkie, and the Yorkie is just out of there, right? So around that age, they start responding to new things with fear. So from Catherine Lord's perspective, that most important part of the critical period is between 4 weeks and whenever the fear response turns on, because that's when you can introduce them to things and they're not going to be afraid of those things. So you have this massive bang for your buck of showing them things and they're like, oh, this is normal, I don't need to be afraid of it. After that, you have to start being cautious and doing lots, introducing carefully. And so So then they're still learning like little maniacal things, farther on into what we've traditionally talked about as the socialization period, and so you start seeing these brain changes then around like 16 weeks or 20 weeks. But it's those first few weeks that are sort of the critical period, and that fear response turning on. I don't know of any scientific basis for what we call the fear period, which is the way I think of it is people talking about it is like the animal's been fine and suddenly he's afraid of everything. Not to say it doesn't happen. I've heard too many people say that it does happen, and I think it probably is a thing. But we don't really know what it is or what purpose it serves. There's some idea that it might happen during adolescence particularly, and the paper covers some of that, right? That your adolescence is different for you because you're starting to strike out on your own, and so your fear learning should be a bit different. So I hope that covers it. Oh, people are asking questions. I don't know. Well, let's let Deb go. I'm wondering whether we should answer questions now or like all at the end. Go ahead, Deb.
Okay. Well, that just makes me think of a couple of things. One of them is in the article, I was getting the idea that you're less fearful during adolescence, or fear was harder to learn for humans during adolescence. Okay.
Yeah, so that's backwards from what I just said, right? Because I don't really know what's going on in adolescence.
I don't either.
Well, and it was only one kind of fear, context rather than cue driven. That's the one that changed. Okay, so not both kinds, which I don't know what to make of that exactly.
Summarize that for people. Yeah. So we should summarize that for people who didn't read the article. Does one of you want to summarize that?
I have to find it to summarize it.
I was having some trouble sorting that out.
I can tell you what I remember from it, but I'm not.
Jessica probably knows it.
Well, so there's context dependent fear versus cue dependent fear, right? And those are generally operating together, but it's interesting that this article says those two things turn on at different times and are sort of different in animals. So the cue dependent fear is, I see the thing that I'm afraid of. I see the mailman and I become afraid because I know that the stranger's going to come to the house, right? So that's cue dependent fear. The mailman is the cue, and that's what we normally work so hard on with our dogs to desensitize and counter condition. Context dependent fear means that how I respond is different based on the context that I'm in. So for my dogs, seeing the mailman when the dogs are in the house is really scary because they know that he's going to come and do stuff to the door and put pieces of paper in the box and stuff like that. When they see that same guy or the same truck when we're out taking a walk, they're not scared because they know it's a different context, and they know that the cue doesn't predict a scary event, a scary stimulus in that context. So the cue is the mailman and the context is in the house or out of the house. And the really interesting thing that this paper says, so I had talked about how we don't start seeing this cue response, this fear response early on. And the paper was talking about how cue-based learning, where you learn to be afraid of the mailman, turns on at a different time. I don't remember if it was earlier or later, but it turns on at a different time than context-based learning, in which you're able to learn differently based on the context that you're in. And it's interesting because context-based learning is very dependent on the hippocampus, so that part of the brain may develop, at a different rate or at different times, compared to the part of the brain that controls the cue-based learning, which I'm going to guess is mostly the amygdala.
I mean, I want to know what to make of this. I'm sure we all do, because if context is less, what does it mean for us? If context is less, I don't know what I want to say. They're less if they're less sensitive to context, and what we're doing for the whole time we have them in their first few years of life, trying to help them with their issues. We're not just isolating people. We're saying people when outside, or people in certain contexts, and if they're and I don't know that dogs are designed to also feel the same way about context as humans, but if that's what we're driving toward, then do we need to change the way we craft our desensitization lessons? If they're
right, yeah, right. No, I think that's the frustrating thing about this paper is that you read it and there's all this stuff where you're like, oh, this could be totally relevant, but I have no idea. So welcome to my world, guys. This is the world that I live in, where I'm like, I know this has something to do I know that this will lead, maybe in 20 years we'll know. And I think people could do this kind of research. If people were doing real well-controlled research on training dogs, we could train a bunch of puppies, adolescents, and adults and try to see, if there's different ways, I don't know, work with veterinary behaviorists and have them do different desensitization procedures at different ages and see. But it's, there's not people doing this kind of work rigorously.
There isn't. And, it says here, sorry, Deb. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the graph, I was noticing it said that in childhood, of course, extinction, fear extinction can lead to erasure. And in adolescence, not so much. So like the thing that's telling us there is that all of the time we're doing our rehab, we don't have the kind of fear reduction possibilities as we had when they were younger or when they were in adulthood. Because fear can extinguish but restore in adulthood, it says. But it's just attenuated and subject to recovery in adolescence. It's on the graph if anyone's looking on page 55. And so I wrote on a note here, it's probably later in a conclusion when we're going to get to it, but that we tend to do full court press in adolescents when we think that they're still learning and subject to a lot of flexibility, and we're doing full court press on desensitization on all the things. And the conclusions of the authors, it says future studies aimed at examining whether this treatment is effective during adolescence when extinction learning is attenuated. They call it into question. And so, I know a lot of us are thinking about the practical nature of socialization as less is more. Don't pressure, don't do so much, don't try to teach so much desensitization to all the things. And it might be that we as trainers come upon that practically by looking at the results of our work. And this is kind of supporting, and there are some neural substrates to maybe that's not the right lesson at the right time, or I'm over concluding. So if anyone thinks different thoughts than that or got different things from the paper, I'll put it down even though I didn't pick it up before.
I think that's important because we look at this paper and we look at what they're saying, and right away I want to jump to, well, I need to change what I'm doing or what I'm recommending that people do, because what they're saying is against kind of common practice in a lot of dog training. And I have had a breed in particular, and Jessica, you mentioned breed differences earlier, and I think that comes back in here as well, because I've had Shelties for a long, long time, and I've worked with Shelties for a long, long time. And you talk about fear during adolescence, and the terror that we have as owners, that we're going to see that kind of full-blown anxiety develop in a puppy who was fine. And I've seen it, and I've had it in my own dogs, where you don't see a whole lot. They seem like they're going along developing. You hit some point in adolescence, and man, it's sometimes life altering for the dog and for the person. And there doesn't seem to be a lot you can do with certain dogs. I always said it's certain dogs, because I couldn't figure out what else it could be when everything that we would normally do and try did not work with that dog. Okay. But realizing that there's some biochemical things going on under the surface, and there's still maturation going on. So Jessica, I'll let you take over there.
Yeah, well, so they had a throwaway comment, which I thought was a little bit hilarious, where they were like, well, we're talking about, they talk a lot about neurons and neurotransmitters and the structure of the brain. And then at some point they're like, and in adolescence, clearly hormones have massive effects during the adolescence. Talk about that.
Well, not for our dogs.
Like, they're neurobiologists, and that is, so hormones aren't their thing. But I think, certainly when you have intact dogs, which, I have a almost 2.5-year-old, and when he hit adolescence, there was one day that he just forgot everything. Like, we were in the middle of learning tri-ball, and he was like, I don't know what that round thing is. So adolescent, so hormones have massive effects, and I would be curious, if you spay neuter at a really young age, I'd be curious to see how many brain changes there still are during adolescence when you don't have that rush of hormones. Or if, I don't know, maybe the stress hormones, the adrenals may be changing at that age even so. So I don't know, but it's something to think about, is that the hormone levels are changing around that age, and that may have something to do with some of these things that we see that we think of as fear periods.
Yeah. And also because we're changing our practices on when we spay and neuter. 15, 20 years ago, people were spaying and neutering very regularly before a year old. And I don't see that. Now we're seeing people, at least people who are more educated and trying to do the right thing, waiting longer and longer. And what impact is that having then? Was there a difference, you know, in that brain, spayed neuter brain, as opposed to that implant
Right.
brain?
So I'm wondering, so some people have been asking about how all of this relates to generalization. And so we talked about, you know, cue learning versus context learning, and I'm not sure what it means for generalization, or if it means anything for generalization. I definitely think that it's easier for dogs to generalize during that early period when their brain is really, what this paper terms, more plastic, right? More malleable. I don't know. I guess I can talk about the neurobiology of that, but that's sort of a different part of the paper. What, Amy? Go.
It occurred to me just as you were saying that a lot of times these things are differences of degree that wouldn't be appreciable in a practical sense. So yes, fear generalizes very, very easily. And this paper is talking about that some things are learned differently and some things extinguish at a different rate and some things are harder to learn. But they might be harder as in we found a difference when we looked for it, but it wouldn't necessarily be definitely harder if you were driving your socialization plan. So fear generalizes. Fear learning is an easy one to get. And just because it's somewhat different when we look at it really closely doesn't mean that it's calling into question how fear might generalize in context, right? Because I see some people saying sort of, but that seems different from what we normally think. And sometimes we put a light on the difference, we forget to remind ourselves in a practical sense that we're shading at the little pieces, shaving the little pieces off so we can understand them, but that they may not change what you do. At least some of these things may not change what we do, wouldn't you? You know.
Yeah, for me, the joy of this paper is reading about changes in the brain and things like that. And just sort of, I love those windows into what's going on. And for me, it doesn't change what I would do. It changes how I see it. And I love imagining the mechanisms and imagining what's going on in the brain. What?
Someone mentioned marzipan's pajamas, but I can't.
Oh, marzipan, yes.
It's backwards.
No, yeah, your dog's behind you on the couch. Yeah.
I just noticed that. On that sense, with critical periods, I'd love for you to talk a little more about, like, if that's your thing, starting and stopping, because I think of, you know, when we think of critical or sensitive periods, which we've all learned in psych so much, language especially, right? Eventually the door closes and you're less, able to learn a new language, for example. It seemed like there wasn't really a start to a sensitive period, but more we talked about the end of one. But so much in this paper was talking about it turning on, like it's ready right now for, it's experience expectant right now. And it wasn't before and won't be again, or maybe not so strongly, but I never really thought of them as starting. I thought of them as being there until they closed. And I don't know if I'm reading this correctly or if that lines up with stuff and if that really matters. I mean, maybe for like very young puppies it does matter because you're saying that it doesn't really start until a certain age, but yeah.
Yes, Deb.
Just along those lines, and this, of course, Jessica has a totally different take on this. But one of the things I've always said that's just very general is that people are trying to do the wrong thing at the wrong time with their young dogs. And the reason I think that is because it's really, really hard to do something, to teach a puppy something. But if you wait 3 months, it's really, really easy. So I think that goes along the same lines that you're talking about, Amy, that there are these opened and closed times where learning anything, whatever it is easier. We happen to be talking about fear, but I think learning anything can be easier at certain times. And why are we fighting trying to instill something early when this is something much better learned, say, at 9 months or 10 months? than it is at 3 months. So that, to me, that makes sense with not just fear learning, but with all kinds of learning. That makes sense to me.
So you're thinking that this paper explains a bit more how it might be easier for dogs to learn certain things when they're a bit older.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. And I see people struggle with puppies to try to teach them everything by the time they're 6 months old. And they're not ready. So I would say, in my very vague general way, they're not sure enough. But I think what we're seeing, what this paper talks about, and what you would see more clearly is, there are these times when the brain has developed to the point where it's possible. We have certain neurotransmitters or hormones that are now active that weren't before. Now is the time to teach it, because now it'll be easiest. Just like now is the wrong time to, be exposed to this thing, because now you're going to develop it to it. I think that's certainly possible.
Yeah, and so this paper is very much focused on, so for those who haven't read the paper sort of starts out by saying, we studied developmental periods in rats and mice and cats, actually, in the vision system, because it's very straightforward to measure whether something has vision or not, right? And there's this lovely system where you can where the binocular vision is developing very early on, and if you screw that up, it's impossible for it to reestablish itself later. And then the second part of the paper is sort of saying, like, well, what does this have to do with fear learning? And is there a sensitive, we know there's a sensitive period for fear learning, but are those mechanisms the same as the mechanisms that we understand so well about visual development? And so then Deb is sort of saying, well, if we're thinking about how, the paper is talking a lot about how different parts of the brain develop and different systems develop at later times. And so Deb is sort of saying, maybe we can extrapolate that one more step to think not just about fear learning, but about all, the other kinds of learning that we ask them to do, which I think is very valid. The part of the brain that I suspect is developing later in puppies is the prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that is massively overdeveloped in primates and humans, particularly, because it gives us that ability to have self-control and insight. And so it's nowhere near as large in dogs as it is in us, but they still have one. And it is the thing that allows them to say things like, "Oh, I was pretty scared of that mailman, but I've been learning that he's okay, and so I'm going to exercise some self-control and not freak out." And my suspicion is that when you're trying to teach a 4-month-old puppy to settle down and pay attention to you and actually absorb what you're trying to teach them, that they may just not have the self-control physically, right? That part of the brain may not be developed enough that they physically have the ability to focus, Deb, to talk about your class on focus, right? They may not have the ability to focus and engage with you. They may just not be able to do that yet. And there's no research that I know of, certainly not in dogs. I don't know that there's research in rats and mice on that. I don't know so much about the human literature. I know that people really like to say that the prefrontal cortex is not mature in humans until we're like 20 or something ridiculous like that. And so
from the myelination finishing.
Yeah.
And in males, it's much later.
If ever.
Yeah, right. Don't rent a car. Just a random thought based on what you just said. It would stand to reason. I mean, we're extrapolating beyond what we know here, but if those kinds of lessons are maybe more difficult, whether it's difficult to learn or just difficult to focus in general and not on any particular kind of lesson in the young, then using exposure sorts of things where I'm not trying to make a point, I'm not trying to get you to draw an association, but here, puppy, well subthreshold, here, just look at stuff, and I'm not going to try to teach you things, should be, is kind of our focus when they're young, but maybe for a lot longer than we have been doing it in practical sense. And saving the point of, hey, that, it actually leads to this for a time when we usually, I think we save it for a time when the dog says, I can concentrate right now, but that's not looking at the dog as an organism for how is your concentration in general? What is your learning like in general? Would you like to wait 2 more months, 5 more months to get this? I mean, telling us when to use which kind of fear amelioration strategy would be what I would hope we would be driving at. With hope we can sort of, I know we can't tonight or in your career, but one day in the future, look at that rather than as like, well, he can learn and it's all the same, and just start teaching them. I mean, maybe waiting until they're much older. They do that with children. I mean, there's Waldorf and Montessori and people who say, they don't need to read now. Why don't we just push that down the road a bit? And, when they're really, really, have all the building blocks already in. So I don't know. It was the thought I had when you were speaking.
So the at the very bottom of the paper, which I'm sure no one got to, there's a section called clinical implications.
Yes, I love that part.
Well, of course Amy did, because she's being paid buckets of money to do this today. But clinical implications, I loved it because it basically said we don't know anything. It basically was like, here are the questions we'd like to have answered, so get on it, researchers, as somebody else said, and that. And they asked a lot of the questions that we're asking and that people in the chat are asking. Mm-hmm. So, and one thing specifically is they talked about cognitive behavior therapy, which I think is very similar to what we do with dogs when they're afraid of things. And they asked, should we be doing that differently when we apply it to humans during adolescence? Right now, apparently, there's just, which seems reasonable, right now there's just the one protocol for adults and adolescents, and maybe we should have a different protocol for adolescents. And I was like, yeah, that'd be really interesting. Let's hear about that. But apparently they haven't figured that out even for humans yet, much less for dogs. And they also noted that treatments for fear-related disorders like PTSD, maybe we would tailor those to be different for humans at different ages. And I think that could be relevant for dogs as well. The thing I want to make sure that we do get a chance to talk about, and I want us to not forget to start answering some of those questions and not get too carried away. But there was one really cool thing that they mentioned in this paper, which was that, so they talk about what's going on in the brain during these early socialization developmental periods, how the brain is functioning differently. And then they talk about a lot of studies that have been done working with rats and mice, trying to see, can we affect that in the brain? Like, can we make it start later, stop sooner? Can we reopen it later in life? And they had some success with doing that. And a lot of the things that they did to do that are not things we would ever do to our dogs, like gene therapy and stuff like that, just stuff you would never actually do. But one thing that they had success with, which we do with dogs all the time, is they gave them fluoxetine, otherwise known as Prozac. And they noted that SSRIs like this can affect the brain chemistry in such a way that you wouldn't say that the sensitive period for socialization was completely reopened and it was completely the same as being a little puppy again. Certainly it's not like that. But in dogs, so in humans and rats and mice, there's some evidence to suggest that being on an SSRI like fluoxetine does have changes in your brain that are similar to sort of putting you back into that socialization period and making it easier to learn. And the big takeaway that I had from that is that, well, that's one thing that SSRIs might do that sounds super useful. But B, what it does is it makes your brain able to learn. And so a lot of us think of SSRIs as like, well, we'll put the dog on the pill and that will fix things. But there is evidence out there that suggests it's really important to still be doing the behavior mod the same time that the dog's on the meds. They progress so much faster with both behavior mod and meds, and this is telling us exactly why, that it's putting them sort of back similar to being in that socialization period. But then you have to actually socialize them. Okay, Deb was first. I think Amy was waving her monster around too, but Deb was first. Go, Deb, go.
Okay, I'm going. A couple of things that I wanted to mention that I was thinking about while you were talking. One of them, it has to do with a comment I saw saying, well, this is all talking about humans, but actually it's talking a lot about rats. And we consider it pretty safe to extrapolate between different species for a lot of things. Now, we're not saying that rats and humans and dogs and cats or whatever are all the same, but a lot of these basic functions, I think it's pretty fair. And in science, we would say we often extrapolate and think from one species to another. And things often do turn out to work very similarly, especially in learning. In learning, we definitely have that basic, I taught a class called Basic Learning Processes, which is what's true for everybody, for every species, right? So that was one of the things that I was thinking about. the other then getting back to the idea of SSRIs and the fact that they may be more helpful than we ever realized, but not just by themselves. That their value is they allow whatever kind of treatment you're going to apply to work better, because they allow you to learn better. They allow you to learn something different than the response you had. And I think that's really interesting, a really interesting thing to see. My question there, and Jessica, you would probably know more about this. You would know more than me because I don't know much, is serotonin syndrome and the concerns about being on SSRIs for long periods of time, if that's how dangerous.
Oh, I don't know anything about it, actually.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, we know it's a thing.
It's not long periods of time. It's too much.
Oh, serotonin syndrome. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I misheard you. And yeah, and exactly, it's not long periods of time. It's too much at once, and it can kill you. But when we put
That's important
when
to
we
know.
put dogs on meds or humans on meds, you don't generally get serotonin syndrome, or at least I don't think I've ever even heard of it.
You have to have combos.
Happening from someone putting a dog responsibly on meds. It happens like, I mean, if your dog were to get the pill container and eat it. Or here's an example. One day I gave one of my dogs the other dog's meds and then their own meds too. And then I was like, oh, you just got a double. And so then there was some induced vomiting that happened because of that. But on reasonable amounts of meds, that doesn't happen.
That's not okay. So the long-term use of a low-dose SSRI wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, no, there can be liver damage, and so long-term use, we like to check the liver once a year through a blood test to make sure that the liver's doing well.
Long-term use if you had an effective training program in place once the learning had changed and once the behaviors had changed. Go on. I'm sorry, Amy. Go.
Well, that's part of the because I had this very same kind of conversation in I took psychopharmacology, clinical psychopharmacology class, and there's so much unknown at that level, at the clinical, at the doctoral level of just giving these things out for behavioral medicine. People were still, at least when I was in school, still arguing that, when you're giving these things that increase serotonin in your brain, it actually downregulates the synapses that you have that respond to them. So you don't have a net increase necessarily. You might have still a stasis. So it's not clear what it's changing. And it's always been, it's always had a bit of a try and see. It's safe. Let's see what it does. Safe enough. Let's see if it helps you. The exact mechanism of how it's helping you is not really settled, it seems, and so many people out there
it's not at all
really
settled.
not at all settled, and so many people out there really feel that it's like, I have a chemical imbalance, or I don't have enough serotonin, so I'm taking something that gives me more, right? And I've known for kind of, we all know now, some of us know that's not exactly what's going on there. But what I'm excited about in this paper is that, we can give these meds and see a lot of great changes in many individuals, and often don't know what to hang it on. And so we look at it and think, well, perhaps you're feeling better because things are more in balance. Perhaps you're feeling you had not enough serotonin, and so now that you have enough, you're feeling better, and we can do our lessons. Or it's relaxing you, so a relaxed dog learns better. But what I like in this is the proposed mechanism of I'm replasticizing, I'm bringing back in some plasticity. I'm taking the hard clay ground and I'm aerating it a whole bunch so we can see if we can plant anything, which seems mechanistically sound here from what we're sort of looking at. Like, it's not just, hey, here's some serotonin, you kind of feel better. It fixed an imbalance, which we know isn't really what's going on. And that says, hey, let's bring you back to some plasticity. Perhaps it has also some calming effect and also some, because it's not just SSRI, right? There's dopamine involved and all the others. And if I can bring in some plasticity and teach you stuff, I can think about what the future would be like with you off of it. So I like the idea of a mechanism being pretty more clear than just, I don't know, it's kind of fixing stuff, right?
I like it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
It's I just wanted to have a quick shout out to, there's a gosh, if we have show notes, maybe I'll try to put this in there, but there's this great hour-long presentation by Robert Sapolsky, who is the king of endocrinology and understanding the stress response. And there's this great, I think if you go to YouTube and you Google Robert Sapolsky depression or something like that, he gave this talk where he talked through exactly what Amy was just talking about, what we understand about what serotonin does in the brain when you're depressed, and what we don't know. And basically, very similarly, just saying, like, here's some things that we understand, but we don't really know what's going on. You know, and the great example is that when you start taking an SSRI, the levels of serotonin in your brain go up pretty much immediately, like that day, but it takes maybe 4 weeks for you to start seeing behavioral differences. And so why, you know, so why is that if it was just the straight up levels of serotonin?
Yeah, it's architectural change. We have to build new architecture. Yeah, it's not serotonin, straight up.
Yeah, so someone just put the link into the chat for those of you who are there. I don't think the chat will be there for the YouTube version, so I'll try to find it for that. But it's great for people who want to know more about this. He's a great speaker, and it's a really fabulous description of exactly what Amy was talking about. Deb.
Thank you. What was I going to say? Oh, so they talked about the SSRI and serotonin. The thing I would like one of you to explain to me is when they talk about reconsolidation update. So in that last section, right under the talking about different serotonin, they say a recent behavioral intervention termed reconsolidation update, which relies on presenting extinction training within a temporal window opened by an isolated CS presentation, also leads to persistent attenuation of the fear memory. And I'm thinking, but isn't that just like counter conditioning, or I'm not sure what they're saying there, and I don't know if anybody else is sure what they're saying there, but could help me understand that.
Amy, do you want to take that one? Do you understand what they're saying?
I want to reread the paragraph right above it. Where did you find that? Because reconsolidation is when you're reaccessing a memory and
it's right under
re-encoding it.
It's the next to the last page. How's that?
Someone suggests, someone in the chat, Liz suggests maybe page 57.
Yeah.
While you're reading that, Amy, I'm gonna talk a little bit to give Amy a chance to read it and to say that. So I remember reading this bit and sort of being like, oh, this kind of stuff isn't something that I understand, that I'm real reading about. But I know that there's a lot of work out there in humans with PTSD, and there's this idea that, you know, so the problem with PTSD is you have a trauma and then your brain sort of gets stuck in its response to the trauma, and it can't get itself back to its equilibrium. And so there's been work with PTSD survivors of can you basically sort of reopen the trauma, so convince the brain that whatever the trauma was, it's just happened, it's not in the past, it's just happened. And then can you then convince the brain to go behave appropriately afterwards? And so I again, like I'm really pulling this kind of out of my butt here because I really don't understand so well how they do this. And it's not something that's done in dogs so far as I know, just in humans. But I seem to remember there's some protocols where they'll do things like basically have the person sort of relive the trauma in some way and then give them some particular medication.
Yeah, you're covering it.
Yep. Yeah, so that's basically, so there's therapies out there for that, and I just don't understand them well because they're very human specific. And so I'm a veterinarian, I don't care.
Yeah, it's
but they're interesting, and they may be things that are relevant to dogs. We just haven't tried them.
Yeah.
You're true, we haven't, because it's hard to get them to, it's hard for us to say that they are reaccessing a memory, right? Because if we're going to reconsolidate, we're saying, I'm going to have you remember a thing, Deb. I'm going to have you talk about what it was when you defended your dissertation, right? And while you're activating, and while you're activating that memory, while you're bringing it up, it is labile. It is subject to modification at that point. And then when you re-encode it, kind of store it away, it can acquire whole new aspects, which is why our memory is never a recording of anything that happened, because we keep re-remembering. I mean, how many of your favorite songs you can remember when you heard it, and also another time when you heard it, and also another time, and they're all encoded in the song. When you remember the song, you have 100 other things that get tagged. And so they're talking about here doing a reconsolidation update, bringing it all to mind and modifying it while it's out there and kind of susceptible to being rewritten a bit, and discussing maybe how they might be able to do that here, and whether that's going to be useful.
Yeah. And
especially if you're more plastic, if things are plastic, you can do that. If they're not that plastic, you don't get to do that. So reinstigating plasticity maybe gives us a possibility of reconsolidation in a new way without the CS being so tied. But now I present the stimulus and it's not so bad, and so now that's what you've learned. Beta blockers, again, another very good. It's what that's good for divorcing the emotional content from the the knowledge you have of what happened to you.
Yeah, okay. Thinking of it as a memory processing makes a little more sense to me. I mean, I was thinking about it was a little bit more straight classical conditioning. But.
Right, yeah, and that's why I wanted to rethink that, because I knew I was thinking of that before. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So and quick shout out to the people in the chat who are saying that they have PTSD and that they have gone through some therapies very similar to this. So thanks for weighing in. I think we should try to answer some of the questions because it's been an hour. It has flown by.
I've been marking a bunch. Some we got already.
Yeah, Amy, do you want to try to?
Sure, we can. I didn't mark everybody's necessarily. I marked some. Some people's got marked all by themselves. And
there's a way that you can select a question and have it shown. Can you do that?
Yes, I can do that.
We can mark it, and if you go to QA mode instead of
and then you do this.
Yeah.
And then you do like
I'm
that
so much
kind
bigger
of
than
thing.
you guys now.
And then you do like that kind of thing.
Oh, look.
And we can just go down through these, and
isn't that nice?
I'll pick ones that I think we didn't hit, or because some of them we answered along the way. Let's see here. I guess we don't really know the answer to that question, but if anyone has any thoughts there, yeah, that's what we'd like to know, right? That's what we'd like to know is whether applied counter conditioning is best done at a certain stage in life or not.
Yeah, is it harder for adolescents to absorb it? That is so fascinating. It's something I hadn't really thought of before reading this paper.
All right. Let's see, what else do we have? How about something like that? I mean, our breeds,
I can try to take this one if you guys are.
Well, whoever thinks of an answer, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so this person, Sandy, is asking how the critical period staying open for different lengths of time, does it allow for more or less experiential learning to affect the various senses from breed to breed? So maybe this could affect why some breeds have more acute abilities like seeing and smelling. So it's a great question. So so there's this idea that early on in life, some breeds, and someone else had asked what the actual timing was. So in this this paper that I will find the reference for, and when we put this on YouTube, I will include the reference for the paper in the notes on YouTube. It was a 2015 paper by Pate and Morrow, I think. And people can email me as well to ask for the reference if they have trouble finding it. But anyway, so the paper showed that that paper looked at 3 different breeds: Yorkies, Cavaliers, and German Shepherds. And it found that the German Shepherds started showing fear as early as 5 weeks of age. I want to say that Cavaliers not until 7 weeks of age. So that was a massive 2-week difference, which is 2 more weeks for these animals to be in this learning state where they're not afraid of things as easily. And so the question is, what effects does that have on it as an adult? And we definitely can imagine that would have an effect on what kinds of things they are afraid of. And so Sandy is asking, could it affect their abilities like seeing and smelling? I would think for a lot of breeds, Differences in seeing, for a lot of breeds, it's very physical, it's very morphological, right? So like sight hounds, the shape of their head affects how they see. And we know that sight hounds have a very different way of looking at the world than flatter face like pugs or bulldogs.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a lot of it. But it's interesting to think about whether this could affect how they see and they smell. I don't know. I would guess that it's physical things like seeing and smelling are going to be a lot more related to morphology, but no one's looked into it, so I don't know for sure. Someone asked if the timing would change when to place those puppies into new families. No one has really thought about that. But we place puppies at 8 weeks, and so far as we can tell, everybody has started being afraid by 8 weeks. So, but it might mean that German Shepherd owners, German Shepherd breeders should be more careful about really being careful about socializing earlier. Don't know.
That's true. This question was, I remember it came in when you were talking about like fear just even first coming online. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and my understanding is that by the time dogs are moving out of the nest at 4 weeks, they can see and hear pretty well. That it's sort of 2 or 3 weeks while they're still in the nest that, their eyes are opening at 2 weeks. Gosh, I should know when hearing stabilizes, but I believe those things happen by 4 weeks. Don't quote me on that. So that's my understanding, is that basically the dog senses are online and they're out and moving around by 4 weeks, and then they have that sort of week or two before the fear response sets in. Catherine Lord did some really interesting research comparing dogs and wolves. It showed that wolf puppies are moving around before they can really see and hear all that well, and they're just smelling. And that she feels that is part of why dogs and wolves are so different socially.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know if we know this, but I thought you might. I mean,
what are the implications?
I had some thoughts. I was wondering because we many of us in the medication loving world want to say early and often, in the sense that if your dog is troubled, you don't need to wait 5 years and finally resort to Prozac, right? But that's because we have our hands on and we see how helpful it can be and all of this. And I was wondering if maybe because it's helping in a plasticity potential mechanistic way, that early being, it points to early being still helpful because you're closer to when plasticity was already naturally there and you're maybe keeping it going, or maybe, change, so I don't know, maybe that's part of this question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know that there's been, so one question is exactly what Eve means by susceptibility to medication. So you're interpreting it as whether it's a good idea to medicate or whether medication will help the animal, I guess.
Right. I was, yes. I don't know what Eve meant. We'll see.
Coming at it as a veterinarian, I look at it as which medication is going to be helpful. Right? Because we've all heard these stories about animals going through this issue of like, well, we know the animal, or we think the animal could benefit from medication, but you try one thing and they have bad side effects, and you try another thing and it doesn't really work so well, and you try a third thing, and eventually you find something that works, but you have to go through 4 weeks of each, and it's a horrible and long process. And when they have side effects, it's not fun. And so one of the things that in my library that the laboratory where I work, that we use to try to get funding is say that we're hopeful that we'll be able to, if we can better understand what the medications do in the brain and the genetic differences between different individuals, then hopefully someday there could be a genetic test where you could say, oh, fluoxetine for you and clomipramine for you. That would be great if we could do that precision medicine for dogs and humans, but we don't know. So like we don't know any of this, right? We don't know why it works. We don't know. Neurobiologically, we don't know when is right to all we can do is behaviorally say, this dog's not improving and we think it would help.
And along the lines of things we don't know, I think this is another thing, but it's still an interesting question in that, yes, we should assume there's wide variation in timing for dogs because there's enormous variation in what is completely normal in a developing human, infant, toddler, and child. Like when everything happens has a wide range and is still considered very normal. So if we're thinking like, there's a fear period at 4 months, or there's a fear period at 9 months, or there's a fear period because my dog is afraid. Even if we knew that there were these fairly classic ones that happen in certain times, you still couldn't say, because every breed has such a different maturational arc, that it might not be a question we need to be focusing on right now. Not that everyone's focusing, but that question reminded me of this. I mean, there's so much variation that the question gets incorrectly focused quickly, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm I think you're absolutely right about that, Amy, and I was totally distracted by the comments that are telling me that there is a genetic test for humans for finding them which medications to take, and I'm like, crap, they already know it. No, but
what? Wait, I'm looking at the questions. You're in the real chat. Hang on, I want to go over there.
Yeah, a couple people. Is it the same person, Megan O'Connor?
I'll get down there when I'll look when we. Because I don't want to lose where I am in the questions here.
Yeah, so other people think it exists. I've never heard of it. Well, you guys have to go find it and find links about it.
Yeah, we'll read it publicly and talk about it. I totally want to read, because
we'll check it out.
Psychopharmacology is something I'd love to read more about here with you guys.
It's called Genomind. I mean, so I'm clearly going to go Google this now. Hang on.
Okay, you do that while I look at the next question, because there's only really a few others that I tagged here. It's not too many others, because we hit quite a few of them as we were talking. Is there research being done on mental illness in adolescents? Yes, there is, Lisa. Can a dog get on an SSRI, be desensitized, and get off it successfully? Morgan, yes. The answer is that is possible. But each given dog is its own case, so yes and or no.
You guys just yell at me if you need me. I'm reading about Genomind.
Yeah, you read about those things. And Deb, honestly, step in. I'm just kind of driving because I'm driving. You can drive if you.
I'm agreeing. If I disagree,
okay.
I will speak up.
Okay,
but
excellent.
I'm not my head over here. But yeah, that makes sense to me.
Sandy, what she was, and I'll give this to Deb, what she was talking about, when we compare species, yes, dogs' brains develop differently, but not the kinds of things that we're talking about that we feel comfortable generalizing are things that are conserved evolutionarily, which means we see the same thing in pretty much everybody. It's not so much like we have to reinvestigate it with each new species because it is conserved. So that's the sort of stuff. It's not really dependent on how development goes in each species when we're talking about the things we were talking about, like fear. Fear is a very basic thing. If we were talking about personality, then yes, we would have to look species-wide. So, Deb, it was while you were talking that she asked this question when you were talking about can we look at rats and extrapolate?
And we do all the time. I mean, science is based on rats.
Yeah, rats and 20-year-old college freshmen, male college freshmen.
I'm going to paste a link. Guys, I'm pasting a link into the chat, which is the list of genes that are analyzed by this thing. And I'm reading about them now. So there's only 18 genes, and a lot of them are things that I've heard of before. I'm going to say that this test is based on real science, but that it's sort of stating how much help it's going to be. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's here's one gene, the serotonin transporter, and they're like, use caution with SSRIs. Well, I mean, like, we know this gene and we know that it does some stuff, but there's a lot of debate about how much effect it actually has. Interesting. I'd love to talk to doctors who've actually used this and sort of get a feel for whether people think it's how useful people think it is. Anyways, I'm sorry. I totally interrupted. Go on.
No, I'm looking through if there's any other kinds of questions. I put one up. I'm not sure if we have an answer to that one.
Classical. Typically, we focus more on classical conditioning to start with. Operant conditioning is usually coming along for the ride as well anyway, and they're both happening. So this article, I think, was focused more on classical conditioning. But it would an effective learning program would definitely be thoughtful in terms of how both of these things are working together, and that's kind of the best we can say about it. Pay attention to both, but if you had to choose one, I would always choose classical.
Yeah, because Pavlov's always sitting on your shoulder.
Yeah. And I say that going, though, there is that little bit of research here and there that says your behavior has a strong influence on your emotions too. So if you can change behavior, you can change emotions. So it's not just outside in, it's or inside out, it's also outside in.
I think it's one of these things that over time, one day in the future, when those of us who are here are long dead, we will stop comparing and thinking of as separate. I mean, I realize these models are separate because we have separate terms and we need to talk about them separately. But like nature versus nurture, no such thing. There's only nurture acts upon nature, and nature gives nurture something to act upon. It's all kind of one big circle, and so. In many ways, we don't have to think of behavior and the way you feel and the associations you make as all that terribly separate. We separated them so we can talk about them in a model sort of form. But I can imagine one day in the future the conversation getting much more integrated, if we will, because there's always behavior going on and there's always associations getting made if you're conscious, and there's always an emotional system online. So, one day out there. Dog is ringing the bells. Don't teach your dogs to ring bells, people. Then they ring bells. Yeah. And then they ask people out. And I don't let her out because that would be good caretaking, and I'm never going to do that. Consent. Okay. Tanya, you asked, would that change to place when puppies go into new families? And I wasn't sure if. So if you're still listening, Tanya.
She's talking about the whole, the difference in when the onset of fear between.
When fear happens, and yeah, we don't. Right, and so the next question is also this one, which is similar. We can throw up a few of these.
Don't know.
We don't know, right?
Right, we don't know. We don't know.
We don't know. We wish we knew. We think we know. We don't know.
Yeah, I think that in like going and looking at village dogs and seeing how long the puppies stay with the moms could be an interesting question, and I'm sure that's been done and that's known, but right. I don't know off the top of my head how long they stay with their moms, but it's longer than 8 weeks.
And then because breeds are so different, and I'm not even sure that's considered a breed or you've just said that your example of the shepherd puppies at 5 weeks versus the Cavaliers at 7 and such. So we could say yes, keep. This kind of dog until, the more suspicious breeds, the ones who need more time, I tend not to just want to lean on a whole lot of anecdote, but people with a lot of experience with a certain breed who have socialized and prevented fear and given a lot of experiences to a breed and a real breed specialists. Granted, it's anecdote, right? But
I don't know,
it's built up of a lot of stuff, right?
Would you send a more fearful dog home earlier so that they could have more of an experience of the world, or would you send a more suspicious breed, a dog of a more suspicious breed, home later so they can have more time with their dam? I don't know.
Right, yeah. And is there a fragile period in which you don't want to be moving them at all? Don't give them major changes right at the 8th week. I don't know.
Yeah,
right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, everybody who came here.
Make everybody terrified. We just need to make everybody terrified and give them no answers.
Everyone comes to a big lecture of all the PhDs in the school. We're talking about social, and our answer is, and yeah.
Don't know. You should be worried, but we don't know what to tell you. That's basically what it is.
But this is exactly what science is. I mean, yes. We don't know anything.
Yes.
We have a lot of.
That's why we're dog trainers.
We should worry about it, but we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know for sure. We never say we've proven anything or that we have fact. We have definite facts on things, unless we actually do have data, and we don't have it.
So that's why I'm a dog trainer.
Exactly. Things that are difficult to impossible to answer. So the best we can do is take a look at some of this stuff and see where that leads us in terms of what makes sense logically.
Yes, and you make a great point, Deb, because we need to be good critical thinkers, but good owners of the possibilities this information gives us, right? This tells me possibly we have longer periods of plasticity or different kinds of plasticity at certain times. Possibly these things are true. Now that can just bounce around in my head, not necessarily guide the actions I'll take tomorrow. But if I see things that reflect back on this, we're also quick to, oh, look, there's that thing in dogs, and now that's true. And it's like once you all three of us know that once you peek behind the curtain, you're like, oh man, we don't know anything. We don't know any of these things. None of this is true. I was severely disappointed because I went to grad school in my 40s, so I was already like a fully formed, opinionated human being before I got all that beaten out of me. Well, some of it. I was already 40 when I started grad school, so yeah, that's why I like being a dog trainer, because the answers are right in front of me and kind of practical. Look, the dog sat right now. No, I'm still looking for.
This is the stuff that's fascinating. I mean, I liked this article because it gave me so many different things to think about that are different from what I normally would do or say. And it's like, wait a minute, do I need to be revising things? At least starting as maybe not tomorrow, but starting in my mind, I'm revising the way I would start to approach these things.
Right.
For example, I'm just thinking about how much more pressure this actually should put on breeders who are keeping puppies in that 4 to 8 week range. And I'm thinking, we always said 49 days. Somebody said 49 days is the perfect day to take your puppy home.
It's gotten fuller. Because it's gotten fuller.
Okay. So, but
Probably.
Is that one source enough for everybody to go, oh, okay, this is what I'll do. And so
well, it seems to have
to
been
learn different things, and it changes.
Right, and then puppy culture comes forward and says, hey, go a little longer. And some research on bite inhibition says, hey, maybe a little more time with dams and other pups. But we're still throwing darts and stuff. I bet you all three of us have our own professional answer to this question. I'll tell you straight up that I scoff, disrespectfully, which I shouldn't. So the question is, given all the variability on when fear periods officially start and stop, what do you say when you're asked as a professional for timing of windows? And I say there is no fear periods officially starting and stopping at any agreed upon point that I've ever seen be consistent. And so I am a strong skeptic on the idea of fear periods being a thing that dogs as a species go through, and I don't put much stock in it. I would bow to Jessica if she tells me that there's something for sure really timed really well somewhere, because you're closer to the research than I am now. But I really just inwardly bite my lip when I hear people talking about this is definitely a fear period and it's definitely the one that happens at this time, because I see zero evidence. So that's what I got to say, Jessica Smith.
I went next door to Catherine Lord and asked her this exact question, and she basically agrees with you. She's heard of them, considers they might exist, doesn't have any idea when they would be, says there's some research that, there may be sort of different ways that the different fear responses in adolescence, in humans, I think it was humans. And I asked her to get me those references, so I'm harassing her for those. But and she and I have both said we would love, in the research that our laboratory does, to try to figure this out. We don't even know how to start trying to figure it out, because it's it's so like,
what the hell's a fear period?
What is it? How do you define it? Like, we just don't know enough about it. If it easily
the closest I've ever been able to come to in human, and again, this is not because I know all the stuff about the humans in this, but just these tiny pieces that grab me, are that when we go through major physiological change, we can be more emotionally labile as well. So like, adolescence for humans is a time of a lot of physiological, this is, puberty is a big deal, and it's affecting all the systems. And so, teething in babies is a difficult time emotionally, and not just because it hurts in the mouth, but also because that's a shift babies are going through in their growth. And so I could see, like, I would be looking for in dogs something like, at the 9-month mark, we start to see hormonal changes in intact animals where they are making some maturation. I know Jessica and you and I have talked about this. What is maturity in dogs? What does it mean? But if their brain is reorganizing in a way that is pinned down as maturity, it could make them more fragile or more exaggerated emotionally. I could see that tying into growth spurts or tying into something physical, but I've never seen anything that we could lean on that says that's what's happening, because breeds are different and dogs are done growing so pretty quickly, and So I'd be looking. I'd want to look at that if I were researching.
And there's
Yeah,
so
that's
much
exactly what I would guess too. And so we just had this comment from someone who said, if it's not a fear period, then what is it? Like when they start acting so weird, and I, you know, and so she says this was in 11 weeks and lasted for 2 weeks. And I don't know. They're growing up. Stuff is going on inside their bodies and their brains, and the wiring is changing and the hormones are changing, and it just like they just get freaked out about stuff. I don't know. Or it's a fear period. I don't know. Like I don't know what.
I mean, it can be in anything, period, right? Why is fear fear's the thing we see that's in it? But what if it's right now they're in a growth spurt. Right now they're in a labile place. Right now they are a little more sensitive than some other times, and we don't have to focus on, oh, he's in a fear period, it's going to last 2 weeks or 3 months, or he got in a fear period at 12 months and he never got out of it. And like, that's not how this kind of works. And so why your dog got sensitive at a certain point, clearly something to do with their growth and and changes, but there's nothing consistent. Yeah. So if you just get out of it and say that it's not about dogness, but it's about this dog who is feeling sensitive right now, and what can I do for this dog?
Hard to know.
I think a lot of people make it so much worse because they label it a fear period, they freak out, and they start trying to overwhelm the dog with things in order to fix it. And so instead of doing less, which is a lot of times what I recommend, let the dog stay home for a couple weeks. Don't take it anywhere. If your dog is freaked out about things outside, keep it inside for a while. People don't want to hear that. Right. They want to go out and they want to confront it and they want it fixed. And I think then you've just dug yourself a hole that you're never going to get out of with this dog.
Well, and the paper would agree with you. The paper is saying, how about not full court press on strong classical in these periods, because
it's not going to be that effective anyway.
Because the learning might be altered slightly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the beauty of that is that you don't need to know why it's happening. And so, we're sitting here obsessively talking about what's going on in the brain, and what people want to know is, why is it happening and when is it going to happen? And the answer for sure is, we're 100% positive that we don't know why it's happening and we don't know when it's going to happen. But we do have really good advice for you about how to deal with it, which is just take care of the dog and don't push it.
Right.
So that's good news. That's like the one thing we do have an answer for what to do. That's nice.
But people don't like that answer.
I like it.
Well, they should do what we say.
Like you're doing enough,
I love this. This is not a question, but there's a response. Science is being worried and having no answers. Yes, Kim, that's science. Does anyone?
I wouldn't even say worried. It's curious.
Yeah.
I'm curious about things, and I don't.
Yeah, I'm sure.
What? Yeah.
Yeah, she's just joking. She's going on our jokes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anyone know anything about cats? Because I don't.
No.
Not that much. I know how to train them a little bit, but that's it.
Yeah, I don't know them as a species as far as what their difference. I know that
people
they have they have super. You probably know more about this, certainly, Jessica, than I do. Interesting, critical, much more critical rather than sensitive periods, especially on vision. If and all of their social stuff is well before we ever get them as kittens, and so their windows are closing at 6 and 7 weeks, or when we're getting an 8-week-old kitten, it's kind of done. And something, their visual systems are tuned so quickly. So it's sort of like if you compare kids and dogs, you got 3 years on a kid to get a lot of stuff done. And for dogs, you might have your 16 weeks. Well, kittens, you have 6? But, that's my pulled out of my box. That's all I know.
Yeah. The sad truth is that they have such an interesting visual system that the early 1960s work, where we learned a lot about how you can screw up a visual system really early on, was done in kittens, and it's really horrible stuff. Like
with the horizontal and the vertical. Don't let them see horizontal things.
Talk about it, upset people. But upsetting stuff that we don't do to kittens anymore. But by the way, we still do to rats and mice. So
right.
So that's what I know about cats, unfortunately.
Hey, here's something to know about rats. Something to know about rats. When you enrich them, give them a field the size of your desk with lots of enrichment, things to play with, and they don't live in a teeny little box for a researcher, but they live in just like a large cage with some balls and hamster wheels and stuff to play with. The data we get from them is not correlating all that well with the data we got from them before. So like a lot of our research could be on deprived animals and not so much on
Yeah, totally.
normal.
Totally. And it's
Definitely.
horrible when you look at these tiny little enclosures that you keep them in, and how people think that they can behave normally. I don't know.
Yeah, and we're taking all their hormones, and we're taking all their, we're drawing a lot of conclusions on rats that are not,
Yeah.
living their best life.
Rats and first-year college students.
It's in first-year male college students.
Who are also not environmentally enriched.
They are not. They're all too homogenous.
Yes, the brains are not done.
No, they're not done. And the whole thing, don't put any females into a study because we can't know where they are on a hormonal cycle and stuff. And I hope we're in a period in psychology where we're calling so much of that into question and saying how much of what we've based things we think are fundamental on have been based on, short-sighted ideas of the past. I look forward to, PhDs 40 years from now, not knowing the stuff we got at all, right?
Yeah, that's the other big thing about science, if you want to talk about science in general, is we're open to the fact that we're probably wrong, and that a lot of things that we think we know are not really going to turn out to be true later on when we're better at measuring and testing. We're aware of that. We have to own that. So it's not like science is saying this is right and we believe this is right forever. We know it's open to adjustment over time, and we'll learn more, we'll learn better.
This was her real question.
Famous book. Let me just respond to Deb first. There's this famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, which talks in really interesting ways. It's a really interesting book to read to sort of think about what science is and how we think about science. And he talks about how we sort of, we build up these scientific theories about how the world works, and they explain things fairly well. And then we realize that it's wrong, and we build up a new theory, and it explains things a bit better. And we live that way for a while. And then we build up a new theory, and we're like, oh, that's wrong, and we build it. So he goes through it, I think, with astronomy, but it's very applicable to biology as well. And so it's not that everything that we know is wrong, but it's that, we have these ways of thinking about things, and we're like, oh, well, like genetics is a great example, right? Where we looked at genetics as this fairly straightforward thing that Mendel explained, and we started realizing, oh, it's much more complicated, and there's all this other stuff. So Mendel wasn't wrong, he just sort of didn't really explain everything fully, and some things didn't fit in, and so now we have these new systems for thinking about it, and it's better. It does a better approximation of what you see, but then, presumably we'll start getting closer and closer. So anyways, for those of you who want to think about that sort of philosophical stuff, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, fabulous book. I read it in college, and it rearranged my brain.
I need some rearrangement. I'll ask you to type that out.
That's fun, huh? Yeah.
We took her question and we went on a tangent, and this was her real the crux of her question, but I don't know that we have the answer to this either.
Yeah, no one knows that.
No one knows that. Sorry, Lisa.
There's still some question about, we're still having questions about how early spay neuter affect behavior. We still don't know if it does or not. And that would sort of have to be decided first, I think, but no one really knows. No one really knows how hormones affect that stuff.
I mean, plasticity itself is just, it's a pretty new topic as far as, in my undergrad, there wasn't much, there was no neuroplasticity. And by the time I got to grad school, there certainly was, and we were really talking about it. So I can't imagine that we know much about removing hormones and what it does to a mechanism we're only just beginning to ask any questions about. So that won't be in our...
No, the way we study it these days is we'd study it in rats and mice, and it's just,
Yeah.
We don't have a really good way of measuring. Well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe neurobiologists do have a good way of measuring brain plasticity. But the way we would do a study like this these days is we, basically spay or neuter rats, and then we'd measure exactly what it does in the brain, like at this very detailed reductive level, right? And then but it wouldn't really tell us anything about behavior, certainly not in dogs or humans. So people haven't really done it.
We're far from that one. Yeah, they want you to type the name of the book.
I'm typing it.
Type it! Jessica!
Ah,
Typing!
there it is.
There it is.
I'm going to make a note about things I need to put in the show notes, right? What do we need to put? We need that. So then we need this Sapolsky lecture. We need structure.
Yeah, everybody read Sapolsky. Everybody watch Sapolsky. If you don't want to read, put him on YouTube and fall in love with Sapolsky.
That has to do with zebras.
Why zebras don't get ulcers?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good book.
That's the
Great
classic.
book.
That's a great book.
So is The Trouble with Testosterone. That is a great book. It's not male bashing. It's
2015
awesome.
paper. Yeah, 2015 paper. I will put it in the show notes. Thank you, Liz.
Okay. One thing I wanted to say about this statement here, it's not really a question, but she mentions there's a lot out there anecdotally anyway. Yeah. And that's the problem. Anecdotal evidence is a big issue. It's like, oh, that's what has happened to me, or what is common in my breed, or what, my breeder has seen over and over again. And granted, I believe people when they give me anecdotal information, that's their experience or what they've been told, but that's not scientific evidence. So we have to be really careful, because I can say, oh, anecdotally, herding dogs have much more severe fear periods than other breeds, from my experience. But that doesn't mean that's really true overall. I don't have the scientific evidence to back that up. So I think we want to be careful whenever we talk about anecdotal evidence. It's something somebody believes is real, but
yeah. And humans we're not good at checking our own biases, and we have all kinds of confirmation bias. If you believe there are fear periods and you're sure that you've heard these things and fear periods happen at these points, when your dog shows an unusual fear of something which might not even be lasting, that's the first thing you're going to think, right? We don't check these biases in ourselves very well because it's just not the way we're built. So we're looking for confirming evidence all the time, not disconfirming evidence, which is what we should be looking for. So, we have to keep staying together and talking out loud to each other so that we get checks and balances on our thinking rather than just thinking of ourselves.
Confirmation bias is a real thing.
It's a real thing.
Things that agree with what we think we know, and we ignore the things or minimize the things that disagree. So we like
to be right.
Of course we do.
We like to know stuff. Exactly. What did Sharon say here? She says,
yeah, I think this would be a great thing for us to close out on.
Yes, great thought, Sharon.
We should each
no.
answer it.
I think looking at this,
yes.
Yeah, I think what I'd say is there's nothing in this paper particularly that would, that I'd be like, based on this paper, I would change this timing to that. But I would say that based on the conversation that we've had, I'd say to owners or breeders, keep thinking, keep an open mind, keep learning. Don't assume that just because everyone's always done it this way that it's the right way. Don't assume because you hear anecdotal evidence that it's right. Don't read one paper and decide that you should change things based on that paper. Just keep putting everything together into your brain and thinking about it and talking to other people. Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds very reasonable. Yeah.
It sounds reasonable. Yeah. Go ahead, Deb.
I would say I hate to say this, but it confirms what I already said, especially about there being the right time to teach things. I can't tell you what that right time is, but I believe, hey, everybody is big. But I think there is a right time out there, and that we shouldn't rush puppies and young dogs to try to get in things that will be easier later. Let them be dogs, let them be exposed to the world, let them have a good relationship with you. I'll do a lot of other things. And if you get to a year old and they don't know sit on cue, most of my dogs don't. And they'll get it. And it'll be really easy when they're 10 or 12 months old. That much more than it would be when they're 3 or 4. So
yeah, you're right, Deb. You're really right. And we're in no rush, and we rush so much. And before it gets off the chat, I want to say to Eve, yes, you are right. Experts having observations is a great source. Anecdotes are a great source of things to test. They're a great source of things to consider and think about. They're not a great source of things to believe, but they're still a great source. The things I would change or things I would say to owners based on all this stuff. I'm with you, Deb. I think that if we knew more about exactly which lesson was correct developmentally, we would just say so here. We don't know, but I'm always thinking about it. I'm always thinking, is this the right developmental period for this dog to learn this lesson? And I don't know the answer, but I'm asking the question and I'm saying, hey, you don't concentrate so well right now. Why am I even beginning to think of things that require concentration and forcing you to concentrate?
Yeah.
Hey, you're super interested in all this other stuff right now. I'm gonna let you be you and craft. I'll organize your first year dog based on who you are, dog, not based on the puppy book, the goal I have, the sport foundation that needs to be put in, but who you are. If you're telling me you're super sensitive about a lot of things, then I need to change the way I raise you. And I know that's not the recipe that people want and sometimes need, or the answer you can always give professionally to everybody, because it requires them understanding developmental periods and what might be right. But that's not my concern when I'm thinking about what we should be doing in a large sense. I want to have goalposts and guiding principles that help me, and we'll figure out how it is we tell the public, or how it is I tell one person in front of me at a different time. Listen to your dog. Think about what juvenile periods really are, what you were really like as a kid, what you were really like as an adolescent, and cut your dog a lot of slack. It's not easy growing up, and it's not easy being in school or worse in boot camp all the time and having precision be what your life is about. And I know we're not super like that here, but let babies be babies and connect to them emotionally and make them feel safe and take care of all that stuff, because there's plenty of time for school and where you're supposed to put your back end, you walk next to me and all that. There's plenty of time for that. And there's not plenty of time for growing up well and whole and safe and all those things. So that's where I go with that. So
yeah,
that's
I
lovely.
totally agree. I've seen so much damage done doing things too early. Very little damage done waiting. I'd err on the side of wait. Don't be in such a big hurry. You've got 15 years if you're lucky. So don't try to get
for school. Yeah. I mean, there's plasticity to deal with for showing you the world and all of that. But as far as lessons and things you need to know, there's so much that can be waited for. Did anything come in while we were talking? Thank you for your thoughts.
And we're not answering any more questions. We're going
no
to
more
bed.
questions. We're winding it down.
Girl, I'm going to bed.
You're welcome, Lucy. You're welcome, Deborah. You're welcome, Laura. I hit
Thanks
something on a nose. I don't know what that means.
So much fun.
It was. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'd love to do it again, wouldn't we? Wouldn't we, Science Cafe?
Yeah, you guys have to find me a paper next time. Find me a paper.
We'll find another topic. We'll pick a topic and we
can just talk.
I think we pick a topic and we contribute what we, what we've learned from the place we're at. I mean, I think that would be so much fun. We'll schedule it. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was so many of you were here and you stayed up late into it. So
questions were great.
Really, thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not sure how to end it, so maybe we should.
All right, I can do it. I'm going to hit stop.
And we're going to hit stop recording. So if anyone's still listening, don't listen to this part. We're going to technology.
You
we're not
already.
Technology.
I think we hit stop recording.
No, I think let me try it. Hang on.
If we hit stop recording, I just want to make sure it saves.
That's the problem, right?
Right. I tagged Melissa, but she's not here. I hit the
stop recording button, but I can hit the power off button, but I think that'll just close everything.
Yeah, no, we don't want that.
We need to hit this red button, I swear.
Oh, here we go. Recorder layouts. Choose a room layout for your recording. You can change it while the recording is on.